I claimed I was a victim, but I've been secretly meeting my ex in a submarine in the Atlantic Ocean, and yes, I can hear how deranged that sounds even as I'm saying it out loud, so let me introduce myself before we both choke on the absurdity. I'm Mara, 32, an emergency room nurse who moves through 12-hour shifts on a diet of black coffee and adrenaline, the sort of person who can find a vein in the back of a shaking hand at 4 in the morning and tell a frightened teenager exactly how brave they already are even while my pager is nagging my hip into a bruise. When I tell you I claimed I was a victim, I don't mean I went to the police with a false statement or made a spectacle on the internet. I mean I mastered a quieter, tidier version of it, the kind you can perform with downcast eyes and a phrase about emotional manipulation that makes friends tighten their mouths in your defense and book you on their sofa for safety. The kind that lets you step around your own wreckage and call it debris from someone else's storm. The type doesn't have a headline because it looks too normal. It's made from small size and the sentence "he did a number on me," which is sometimes true and sometimes convenient and often both. I leaned on it because hypocrisy walks better in flats. The man in question, I promised myself I'd stop calling him a man in question and just say his name, is Elias. He is 34 now and he used to build prototype robots for research labs and now he outfits boutique expeditions for wealthy people who want to point at charts and claim they touched mystery. If you read about a philanthropist supporting ocean exploration, and then see photos of smiling people in navy jumpsuits next to round windows framing blue, you're looking at his work. We dated when I was 23 and he was 25 and neither of us believed time could end because it hadn't yet disobeyed us. He was the sort of boyfriend who kept odd hours and left crumbs of enthusiasm wherever he went. He carried notebooks that smelled like the last page of a good book. He listened with his whole face. I loved him with that wide, stupid fearlessness that convinces you your heart invented water. We fell apart for reasons people fall apart when the future fires warning shots. Distance, obsession. The way ambition can be a third person in the room who orders dessert and then eats your fries. He flew to Norway for a 3-month contract that stretched to 8. My mother was recovering from surgery. I was learning how to be a nurse without crying in the supply closet. We wrote letters for exactly as long as nostalgia could carry postage. Years slid, I became steady. I cultivated steadiness as discipline. I moved in with a man named Rob, a carpenter who sings under his breath when he measures, whose kindness is not a theater trick but a daily task. Our apartment is 2 rooms and a stubborn plant. We are not storybook, we are good. We were good is the more honest verb. And before you ask me why a woman with the word good inside her ribcage would step into a pressurized cylinder under miles of water with an old ache and call it an appointment, I'll tell you exactly how it started. A cruise ship had docked in our city and donated surplus medical supplies to the hospital, boxes of gauze and saline and a crate of expired motion sickness bands that made my charge nurse cackle. So the loading bay looked like a nominal utopia. Tucked among the pallets was a thin envelope addressed to MTED Knights, which is me in all the ways that matter. Inside was a postcard of a deep-sea anglerfish, all ancient cruelty and glow. On the back, in a hand I recognized with my skin first, was a single line. We're passing your coast in 12 days for a survey. If you want to see what we picked over you, meet me at Pier 7 at 0300. Bring nothing you can't teach to hold its breath. I would have thrown it away if he'd written anything else. I know this because I tried. I held it over the trash and made the stern face I use on unruly interns and my arm refused to drop. I tucked it into a pocket in my scrubs and told myself I'd show it to Maya on break for an eye roll and a ritual shredding. But the trauma pager yelped and we spent 7 hours softening disasters into survivals, and by the time I remembered the anglerfish, it had already set up a spare room in my thoughts. A reasonable person would have said no. A better person would have drafted a text to Rob that said, "I'm restless and I don't know what that means about us. Can we talk after I sleep for 14 hours?" And then avoided the pier. I am a person who knows how to triage strangers and fails to triage herself with the same ferocity. On the 12th night, I left the apartment at 2:28 a.m., whispering to the dark that I was going for a run because lying is easier when the person you lie to is asleep. And your shoes are in your hands. Pier 7 is the sort of place the city forgets to sell postcards about. The smell of old rope and the sea when it decides to be unfriendly, the metal creak that makes you stand up straight. No tourists, just gulls with opinions. At the end of the pier, a boat waited with its lights frosted and a crew member whose posture said hurry. When I stepped on board, someone put a life jacket in my arms and gave me a wordless look that meant, "Do you know what you're doing?" I shook my head and the look softened. He led me to a hatch and down into a body heat of metal and method, and then there he was, Elias, wearing a cap with salt around the brim and a smile that had grown older and kept its teeth. Hi, he said, as if we had agreed to meet for croissants. The boat pitched in a way my spine didn't admire. He braced his hand not on me but where I could take it if I wanted and I didn't, and those would be the two wolves sharing my chest for the rest of the story. You're late, I said, because it was safer than admitting I'd been early enough to walk the length of the pier twice. You're early, he said, which was either time travel or grace. He handed me a duffel with a jumpsuit that smelled like other people's adrenaline. You get cold down there if you let yourself, he said, a sentence that pretended to be about temperature. And if I tell you to chew gum even when your jaw swears it's busy, chew the gum, which was not a metaphor but behaved like one. We dropped in before my good sense could put on its shoes. The submersible was a sleek white capsule with windows so thick they could alter your respect for glass. The pilot, a woman named Keisha with hair in a braid and hands that held confidence like a pet, walked me through safety with the cheerfulness of someone who knows that fear listens better to jokes. The descent was smooth and then not, my stomach doing a small choreography. I told myself I was just an observer, that I would go down once, satisfy the hunger that had started chewing at me the moment I saw his handwriting, and then go home better, whatever that means. It's obscene the way the ocean changes your scale. City lights burn out and the surface is gone, and suddenly the world is charcoal with a million self-lit punctuation marks, spangles and shivers. I've seen pupils dilate under fluorescence and I've watched grief explode into laughter, but nothing prepared me for how quiet it can be when it wraps both hands around your head and turns it to face where it wants. We hovered over a ridge of hydrothermal chimneys, black smoke as gouting minerals into a world that had invented its own cuisine in the dark. Keisha narrated with intimacy. There's the crab that eats bacteria like candy. That's a ghostly octopus rarely seen. She made marine miracles sound like regular neighbors you'd bump into while taking out the trash. Elias looked not at the window but at me, and I felt watched in a way that wasn't predatory so much as archaeological, as if he were cataloging artifacts he'd left behind and deciding which to return to the museum of us. Do you ever sleep? I asked, my voice a little hoarse from the recycled air. Sometimes near other people's dreams, he said, and I made a face at the line because it was ridiculous and because it was true for him in a way that would be offensive in anyone else's mouth. He told me about a dive where the sub had bumped the seafloor and everyone thought in the space of one lifted heartbeat about calling parents. I told him about a night 12 months ago when a teenage girl came in with a laceration to her thigh, and I had to sew the world back together while her mother held her breath starting to finish. We talked like we used to, around the edges of terror, letting the facts hold hands with the jokes. Keisha let us sit with the show, and then when we'd filled our eyes she rose toward gray. The transition back to human weather was disorienting. In the wet cold of the deck, Elias handed me a thermos of tea that tasted faintly of engines. Still honey, no sugar, he said, and I wanted to bite him for remembering the thing I would have asked him to remember if I'd been allowed to make a list. Why did you invite me? I asked. He didn't flinch. Because you always told the truth down to the bone, he said, and I was tired of hearing myself rationalize an entire life to people who also make money when I rationalize well. Also because I'm selfish and I wanted to see if you would light up again when the world did, or if I imagined it when we were young. I'm with someone, I said. It came out like a challenge issued from a place in me that wanted to be applauded for the claim. He nodded. Is he kind? He asked. Yes, I said. Does he make you laugh? Yes. Do you look at the clock when you're with him? Sometimes, I said, and hated myself for telling the truth. We agreed we wouldn't see each other again. It was dignified. We shook hands like patients and providers. The boat took me back to the pier and I ran home, showered until the hot water gave up, crawled into bed and let my heartbeat impersonate a drumline. Rob woke, touched my shoulder, mumbled, "You're freezing," tucked me under him and fell asleep again with the kind of trust you can't buy twice. 12 days later there was another postcard. This one a blue whale's tail and a time that coincided perfectly with the end of a shift I could swap. I told myself that returning wasn't infidelity if my body stayed intact and my clothes stayed on and my story stayed corrected. I told myself I would say no at the top of the ramp and mean it. When you've spent years telling cancer patients that denial is not a plan, it's wild how nimble yours becomes when it's saving you from your own clarity. The second dive was rougher. A storm had skirted the coast and the sub pitched in a way that made my inner ear ask for a lawyer. I swallowed gum like instructions. We sank through the churn and hit a place where everything steadied and I laughed out of proportion to what happened because the metaphor climbed onto my lap and refused to be put down. Do you know that feeling of entering a room you don't own and somehow finding your jacket already on a chair? That's what the deep started to mean to me. Borrowed, disreputable relief. We started to talk about us against our own rule. Keisha pretended not to hear, like a bartender in an old movie who polishes the same glass until your confession finds an exit. We mapped the territory we'd refuse to draw back then, how I needed someone to make promises with an inside voice, how he needed to belong to his work with the greed of a zealot, how we had both confused stability with stillness and then punished ourselves for wanting both at once. The submarine's windows lit our faces. Sea blue, and we took turns not blinking. After the third meeting, which wasn't supposed to happen, I told Maya because the lie had started to smell like spoiled milk. I walked to her apartment with the kind of purposeful stride that says, "Please forgive me for not being who you told other people I am." She let me in with a raised eyebrow already cocked. I said, "Don't look at me like that yet," and she said, "I already am." And I explained it all with the sort of detail that proves you understand the prosecution's case. When I ran out of sentences, she took a breath and handed me a glass of water and said, "I'm not the judge," then took another breath and added, "But cheating isn't only a body, it's attention, it's telling one person the truth and the other person the press release. You're a nurse, you know what infections do when you hide them under gauze." "I haven't," I started, and she cut in soft as gauze itself. "I didn't ask," and we both laughed, grateful the word mercy still existed. The fourth dive wasn't for wonders. It was for a survey over a wreck they weren't allowed to call famous because paperwork hadn't blessed it yet. Keisha hummed under her breath. Elias pointed out shapes in silt and named each piece with reverence. He used to name the future like that. When we surfaced, I told him I had to stop. I told him I loved somebody good and I needed to love him without caveats. I told him seeing him opened a door that let in air and also bats. He nodded very slowly and said, "I know I'm not offering you a life, I'm offering you oxygen in the one you already picked. That's not honorable, I'll stop," and the magnanimity of it made me want to push him into the water and also kiss him on the mouth until Salt learned new recipes. I went home resolved, and every cliché about resolve is a cliché because the wind is strong. Rob was making soup. He turned and smiled and lifted the spoon toward me, and I tasted thyme and pepper and the comfort of 1,000 dinners. "You okay?" he asked. "Just tired," I said. The soup cooled. He put on a record we both pretend we don't like, and we danced badly in the kitchen, and I could feel the answer that would have been enough for most lives hanging above us like a harmless chandelier. No more postcards came. I slept through 2 weekends like a marathoner whose spine forgot the word sprint. I went to couples trivia with Rob and did a whole round on maritime disasters with a straight face. I caught myself checking the news for anything about a private vessel and hated the person who clicked. The ER thrashed through a rash of dehydrations and a boy with a skateboard injury who told me that pain is actually just the body interrupting your plans in an incredibly rude voice. I stitched and taped and taught and avoided myself with professional grace. Then one night a tourist submersible made headlines for all the wrong reasons. Not his. I called to make sure. No answer. Probably underwater. My brain staged a riot. I paced. I watched press conferences with the sound off. I went to work and told a woman in labor that she was doing beautifully and then hid in the laundry room to breathe through what wasn't mine. When his text finally came, "We're safe north of the weather. Sorry." I sat on a rolling stool in Trauma 2 and let my shoulders shudder so hard the curtain rings rattled. We didn't meet for 2 months. When we did, it was because he sent a message that said, "Last one. We're relocating the platform. If you come, I'll say goodbye the way I should have years ago." And I read it and everyone on the bus looked ordinary while I tried not to start a small opera. I went because endings deserve daylight even at midnight. We met the boat and I signed the forms and I stepped into the small world of the sub like a woman walking into the last room of a house being sold. At depth, Keisha cut the lights and we drifted. The only glow was from the creatures who refused to be bullied by darkness. Elias took a breath, and because I am a nurse I noticed it was the kind of breath used to dislodge the word truth from the back of the throat. "I loved you," he said. Present tense wanted to photobomb. He let it. "I love you." He didn't reach for me, he didn't sell it, he just placed the sentence on the floor between our feet so neither of us could pretend not to see it. "I love you in a way that cannot be a calendar," he continued. "And that is my failure and my shape. You deserve someone who isn't a tide. I keep thinking the ocean made me this way, but the ocean just gave me better metaphors. Tears in a submersible are weird. They float when you blink and make you feel like your face is a snow globe. I laughed once and then let them fall because I didn't have a better thing to do with my eyes. "I loved you too," I said. "Part of me still does. Another part has learned a more domestic grammar. I think I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't boring, that I still had a lantern inside me that turns on when Wanda asks nicely, 'You lit it?' I have to take it home and not burn the kitchen down." Keisha said, "You two are doing great. This is the most emotionally intelligent breakup I've piloted. which made us both laugh too hard, and then the moment cracked and the pieces fit back into people. We rose. On deck the wind slapped me into the present. He hugged me in that careful, exact way from the first night, as if he'd measured my boundaries and cut to size. "Take care of the hurt," he said. "You too," I answered, and meant the loneliness and the bruises the sea gives to men who ask for them. Ending a secret is not automatically repair, it is airing questions. I told Rob 2 weeks later because he is kind and I am finally trying to be worthy of that. We sat on the edge of the bed we'd bought off a stranger with too many IKEA hex wrenches, and I said, "I have to tell you something I'm not proud of," and I told him the true version without euphemisms. He listened like a carpenter, practical, focused, measuring the joints. When I finished, he leaned forward, elbows on knees, and said, "Did you sleep with him?" And I said no, and he nodded without relief because he is not an idiot. He asked if I loved him. I said yes and no, and that I was trying to convert the yes into gratitude and the no into something we could live with. He cried once, which I'd never seen and will never forget. We took a week apart. He stayed with his brother. I slept hard and cooked badly and learned what my apartment sounds like when it isn't being kind. We decided to try, which is as romantic as it gets for adults. There is no triumph in this sentence, only the stubbornness of people who think the future might be nice if we sand it. We go to therapy now. I say sentences like, "Intimacy isn't just proximity," and he says, "It scares me that you needed a submarine to feel awake," and we both say, "I love you," in a voice that is trying to be more verbs than nouns. Sometimes the ache comes back and I take it on a long walk and don't let it drive. At work, I keep thinking about pressure, how the body holds and caves, how we brace and release and call it surviving. I teach new nurses how to watch a chest rise and fall and hear when a heartbeat is lying. Last week a teenager asked me if love gets boring when it's real, and I told him the truth I can carry. Boredom is a symptom of not telling the truth to the person who could fix the thing you're pretending isn't broken. Wonder doesn't only live at the bottom of the ocean, it visits kitchens and bus stops and laundry rooms, and you can meet it if you stop auditioning for a life you didn't actually choose. Sometimes late, when the ER is a little quieter and we all stand in a circle by the nurse's station just to prove we have bodies, I'll remember the dark windows of the sub and the way the world glowed without asking permission. I'll feel a pulse of guilt and then, right after, a small clean gratitude, because not every sin requires a billboard and not every mercy wants credit. I'm not a victim in the story I told to make my choices look pretty. I'm a person who missed a life she used to think she belonged to and went to see if it would still fit, and it didn't, and that's not tragedy, it's tailoring. Elias moved the platform. Sometimes a headline crosses my feed about a new dive and I don't click. Once a postcard came with no words, just a drawing of a tiny lanternfish. I put it in a cookbook under the recipe for something I've never made. Rob and I built a shelf together and swore at the directions and then kissed with sawdust on our lips, and it felt less like settling and more like arriving. I am not cured of my appetite for the dramatic. I am learning to feed it with art and road trips. And the kind of friends who will sit with you for 2 hours while you talk about feeling nothing and everything. If you were hoping for a moral, I will not hand you a tidy one. I will hand you this instead. Get curious about the places you go to breathe and the people you elect as your oxygen. Say the ugly version of the truth before it grows teeth. If you need the bottom of the ocean to feel alive, notice that, name it, and then ask if you can build a life where you feel awake closer to the surface, where you don't need a pressure hull to justify your pulse. Take a class for no reason. Let boredom be a bell, not a verdict. Take the postcards you write about yourself and flip them over. See who you're really mailing them to. I claimed I was a victim because it let me dodge the person in the mirror who had walked herself to a pier at 3 a.m. and stepped into a machine built to flirt with danger. The truth is kinder and less flattering. I was lonely in a way my life couldn't see, and I went somewhere extreme to hear the part of me that speaks softly. I heard it. It asked for wonder and honesty and the kind of love that doesn't need to be underwater to feel real. I came back, which is the only brave thing I can claim. I am here, which is not a confession or a defense but a present tense fact. And tonight, when the ambulance bay doors lurch open and someone rolls in calling for help, I will take their hand and say, "You're here, we've got you," and I will mean it for them and quietly for me.